In March of 1981, in a county extension office in Buchanan County, Iowa, there was a soil map on the wall that every farmer in that county had looked at least once in his life. The good ground was shaded dark, the average ground was gray, and in the northwest corner, near the river bluffs, there was a patch almost white. 40 acres, Class 6 soil, thin topsoil, heavy clay, limestone close enough to hit with a plow before 6 inches. The extension agent, Dale Measure, had a name for it. He called it dead ground. Nobody argued. That 40 had beaten every man who tried to farm it. It had been rented, abandoned, traded, ignored. The last tenant walked away after 2 seasons and said he'd rather dig ditches than fight those rocks again. The county had practically erased it from crop listings. It wasn't farmland anymore. It was a mistake on a map, and then a 44-year-old farmer named Walter Gunderson bought it. He paid $185 an acre, $7,400 total, cash, no loan, no bank. At the same time, good ground in Buchanan County was selling for $3,000 to $100 an acre. When the John Deere dealer in town, Phil Kramer, heard about it at the feed store, he laughed hard enough to spill his coffee. "Walt Gunderson just bought dead ground," he said. "That's like buying a coffin and calling it a house." The men around him laughed too. Farmers who had just signed notes for new 40 for 40s. Men who had borrowed against land that had tripled in value during the 1970s. Men who believed expansion was the only direction left. And if you want to understand why they laughed, you have to understand what had just happened to American agriculture. Through the 1970s, grain prices soared. Corn hit $3.56 a bushel. Soybeans touched $10. Land prices in Iowa climbed from $419 an acre in 1970 to $2,147 by 1980. Banks weren't cautious. They were eager. The Federal and Bank Production Credit Association, Farmers' Home Administration, they were writing loans like the future was guaranteed. Farmers were told to expand, borrow, buy more acres, buy bigger iron. The world needs to eat. They were told, and they believed it. They leveraged equity that only existed on paper. They paid 40% down on land at 12% interest and signed operating notes. They assumed they'd roll forever. Then in October 1979, Paul Volcker raised interest rates to fight inflation. By 1981, the prime rate hit 21.5%. Operating loans written at 9% were renewing at 18%. At the same time, a grain embargo cut export demand. Corn dropped, soybeans dropped, and land values, the collateral under every farm loan, began to fall. In 5 years, Iowa land values would drop 63% from their peak. More than 300,000 American farms would disappear. But in March 1981, most of Buchanan County hadn't fully absorbed that yet. They were still trying to outgrow the downturn. They were still betting bigger. And Walt Gunderson bought the worst 40 acres in the county with cash. Walt had grown up outside Jessup on his father Hank's 200-acre farm. Hank Gunderson had farmed his whole life with a Farmland M and a 2-bottom plow. He paid off his mortgage in 1950 and never borrowed again. When salesmen came around in the 1970s pushing new tractors and easy credit, Hank told them the same thing every time. "I don't owe any man anything, and I intend to die that way." He did. He died in 1978, debt-free, leaving Walt the land, the Farmland M with 11,000 hours on it, and a workshop full of tools worn smooth by use. Walt's older brother Gerald had already left for Des Moines and didn't want the farm, so Walt kept it. He didn't expand during the boom. He didn't refinance. While neighbors traded up tractors, Walt kept the M running. While others borrowed against rising land values, Walt put $600 a month into a savings account at Jessup State Bank. By early 1981, he had $47,000 saved. That was the difference between him and the men laughing at the feed store. When the estate of Elmer Brandt came up for auction, the good 280 acres sold fast at $3,000 to $100 an acre. Bidding was competitive, but when the auctioneer called out the last 40, the rocky piece everyone knew, there was silence. He had to ask 3 times before Walt raised his hand. $185, No one countered. It was over in seconds. Walt didn't buy dead ground because he thought it was good. He bought it because it was cheap, because he could pay cash, and because he believed something his father believed. If you don't owe, you survive. The next day at the feed store, Phil Kramer stopped mid-story when Walt walked in for clover seed. "Heard you bought the Brant 40, Phil said. Walt nodded. "The dead ground 40. Walt nodded again. Phil looked around at the other men. "That ground won't grow corn any better than it did before." Walt didn't argue. He paid for the seed and left. And here's where most people would expect the story to turn into stubborn pride. It didn't. Walt didn't try to prove anyone wrong with corn. He didn't plow. He didn't disc. He didn't plant soybeans. He walked the entire 40 acres with a soil probe and a notebook. 47 samples. He mapped slopes. He noted where limestone hit shallow. He measured pH 7.8, organic matter minus 1.2%. Good Iowa prairie soil runs 5 to 6%. Dead ground wasn't just rocky. It had been farmed hard for decades and stripped of biology. 3 inches of topsoil in the flats, almost none on the slopes. Every farmer before him had tried to force it into being Class 1 ground. Walt decided not to. In April 1981, while his neighbors were planting corn in climate-controlled cabs, Walt broadcast red clover by hand, 15 pounds per acre. On the slopes, he mixed sweet clover and brome. On the wetter bottom, he planted reed canary grass to hold the creek bank. Phil drove by once and saw him walking the hillside with a canvas bag and shook his head. At the cafe that night he said, "Gunderson's farming like it's 1910. The laugh was softer this time, but it was still there. Here's what most of them missed. Clover fixes nitrogen, 80 to 150 pounds per acre per year. It roots deeper than corn. It breaks through clay. It feeds soil life when it dies." Walt didn't harvest it that first year. He let it grow, bloom, and in October he mowed it down and left it. Biomass back into the soil. No fertilizer bill. No herbicide. No new equipment. While Buchanan County was borrowing at 18% to plant corn at shrinking prices, Walt was building organic matter from 1.2% upward. In 1982, he did it again. Clover. Then he made a deal with a dairy farmer 3 miles away, Art Schultz, who had more manure than he could spread. Walt hauled 15 loads with a borrowed spreader, and his Farmland M8 tons per acre on the flats, lighter on the slopes. That year, the first foreclosures hit the county. Operating loans renewed at rates farmers couldn't cash flow. Land that had appraised at $3,000 an acre was suddenly worth $2,200, then $2,000, then less. The collateral gap widened. The bank letters got colder. Phil Kramer's dealership, which had sold 30 to new tractors in 1979, sold 7 in 1982. 3 of those were repossessions. Walt didn't comment. He took new soil samples that fall. Organic matter in the flats had risen. Not dramatically, but measurably. The soil was darker. There were earthworms where there had been almost none. Dale Mezer heard about it and came to see. He didn't laugh. He took his own samples and wrote a note in Walt's file, worth watching. By 1983, Walt added oats as a nurse crop over the clover on 25 of the 40 acres. He fenced the slopes and brought in 8 head of cattle, rotating them carefully. Light stocking. Move them before they overgraze. Let manure and hoof impact work with the biology instead of against it. That same year, foreclosure auctions became regular events in the county. Men who had expanded the fastest were now liquidating the fastest. Equipment lines formed at sale barns. Phil's showroom grew quiet. And here was the tension nobody wanted to admit. The man who bought the worst land in the county, with cash, was sleeping better than the men who bought the best land on credit. By 1984, Walt harvested oats at 62 bushels per acre. Not spectacular, but profitable. Operating cost roughly $400 total for the 40. Revenue modest but real. Cattle sales added income. Organic matter climbed at a point for percent in the flats. Earthworm counts jumped. The soil was changing faster than anyone expected. And that's when the real risk came. Because building soil with clover is one thing. Planting corn without commercial fertilizer, without herbicide, into killed clover sod, That's something else. In 1985, while the Farm Credit System reported billions in losses and Congress introduced the Conservation Reserve Program to pay farmers to idle highly erodible land, Walt prepared 8 acres of his best recovered ground for corn. No till, modified planter, no purchased nitrogen, no chemicals. The county watched. The stand came up uneven. It didn't look impressive. At the cafe someone said, "Told you." Phil said it looked like hell. And for a moment, just a moment, it could have gone the other way. Because if that corn failed, everything about the last 4 years would look like a waste. But in August, when the heat came and conventional corn rolled its leaves by noon, Walt's didn't. The soil under that clover residue stayed cooler. Moisture held. Roots went deep through channels the clover had cut. When harvest came, the 8 acres yielded 134 bushels per acre. The county average was 128. It wasn't a miracle. It was enough. Enough to shift the room. Enough for Dale Measure to call Iowa State. Enough to make people stop laughing. And the 40 acres that had been called dead ground was no longer a joke. It was a question. And the question wasn't about soil anymore. It was about debt. By the fall of 1985, people in Buchanan County had stopped laughing out loud. But they hadn't stopped watching. 8 acres of corn beating the county average was not enough to prove anything. It was an anomaly, a fluke, a lucky year. That's what most of them told themselves. The land market was still sliding. Good ground that sold for $3,000 to $100 an acre for years earlier was now struggling to bring $1,000 to $100. Men who had borrowed against paper equity were discovering the paper had burned. The letters from lenders changed tone. Restructure became accelerate. Work with you became full repayment. Walt didn't receive those letters. That alone made him different. But different doesn't mean right. It just means exposed. In early 1986, he made the decision that would either validate the last 5 years or undo them. He expanded corn from 8 acres to nearly half the recovered ground. Not all 40. He wasn't reckless. He chose the flattest, darkest sections where organic matter had climbed above 2%. He still refused commercial fertilizer. He still refused herbicides. He killed the clover mechanically and planted directly into residue using the modified planter. He'd built in his workshop, adding coulters himself so they could cut through the sod cleanly. The stand came up better than the year before, but it wasn't perfect. Rows were slightly uneven. Population was lighter than what extension guidelines recommended. From the road, it did not look aggressive. It did not look modern. It looked conservative. And conservative in 1986 still felt wrong to a culture trained to believe bigger was safer. That summer heat returned. Conventional fields across the county showed stress again by mid-July. Walt's did not. The difference wasn't visible from a pickup window. It was underground. Years of clover roots had opened channels through clay. Manure had fed microbes. Soil aggregates held together instead of crusting. Rain that would have run off in 1981 now infiltrated. By harvest, yields confirmed it. Stronger than the year before. Consistent. Profitable. His cost per bushel was under $1. County averages were hovering near 2. That gap mattered more than yield alone. Because yield without margin is survival without oxygen. Around that same time, the John Deere dealership on the highway outside Jessup went dark. Phil Kramer didn't announce it dramatically. The lot just emptied gradually. First fewer machines, then no new ones, then a sign about consolidation. By winter, the building sat quiet. Phil took an insurance job in Waterloo. The same man who had told farmers they needed more horsepower now sold policies, designed to protect what little they had left. Walt noticed. He didn't comment. He kept sampling soil. That year, organic matter on the original dead ground crossed 3% in places. 3% may not sound impressive to someone outside agriculture. In soil science, it's transformation. It means carbon returning. It means structure. It means resilience. Dale Measure came out again with a photographer from the extension office. This time he wasn't skeptical. He was curious. He dug test pits himself. Measured topsoil depth. It had gone from roughly 3 inches in 1981 to over 5 in the flats. That kind of change usually takes decades. I've never seen soil recover this fast, he admitted quietly. Walt answered the same way he always did. It wasn't dead, but growth attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny brings risk. In 1987, a wet spring delayed planting across much of Iowa. Saturated ground stalled equipment. Conventional fields compacted under heavy tractors. Walt's ground absorbed more water. But planting no-till into thick residue in cool soil is not forgiving. Emergence lagged. Neighbors drove by and saw uneven growth. The whisper returned. Maybe the earlier success was temporary. Maybe biology had limits. For the first time in years, Walt felt pressure not from banks, but from proof. Because once you outperform expectation, expectation resets. Now people weren't waiting for him to fail quietly. They were waiting for him to fail publicly. That season forced him to adjust. He tweaked planting depth, adjusted timing, waited for soil temperature rather than calendar date. It cost him days. It risked frost at the back end. It required patience most operators trained on tight schedules didn't have. Harvest numbers that year weren't record-breaking. They didn't need to be. They were stable, profitable, and stable in a collapsing system carries more weight than spectacular in a booming one. Meanwhile, Iowa State University sent a graduate student named Karen Price to study the 40 acres as a formal case. She spent the summer taking measurements, soil aggregate stability, infiltration rates, earthworm counts per cubic foot, root depth comparisons, data that would not bend for narrative. Her findings were difficult to dismiss. Organic matter had risen from 1.2% to nearly 3.8% in 7 years. Water infiltration rate had increased over 300%. Earthworm populations exceeded those of some Class 1 soils nearby. That meant something beyond yield. It meant system shift. It meant the land had moved categories without changing location. Karen titled her thesis, Biological Restoration of Degraded Cropland in Northeast Iowa, a 7-year case study. It would later be cited in research on regenerative agriculture, though at the time most farmers in Buchanan County didn't read academic papers. They watched combines. In 1988, Walt planted 30 of the 40 acres to corn. That decision marked a turning point. It wasn't a gamble anymore. It was scale. Still no commercial fertilizer. Still no herbicides. Still the Farmland M until it finally gave out in 1994. That 1988 corn yielded 148 bushels per acre. The county average was 131. But again, yield wasn't the headline. Cost was. His cost per bushel remained dramatically lower. When land appraisers evaluated comparable restored ground that year, values approached $1 for 100 an acre. The 40 he had bought for $185 was now worth over $50,000, a 657% increase in 7 years, and not $1 of interest paid. The contrast across the county was sharp. Men who had purchased prime land at $3,000 to $100 were sitting on assets now worth barely a third of that, still carrying debt calculated at peak valuation. Some lost everything, not because their land was bad, because their leverage was wrong. That was the tension building under the surface. Walt never preached. He never told anyone they should have avoided loans. He simply kept operating inside his margin. And margins create freedom. By late 1988, the laughter had disappeared entirely. Curiosity replaced it. Farmers who once dismissed him now slowed down when passing the 40. They stepped out of trucks, dug soil with their boots, asked quiet questions. You really didn't put any nitrogen down? Nope, no herbicide. Nope, it unsettled them. Because if he was right, then they hadn't just miscalculated a crop. They had miscalculated a philosophy. And philosophies are harder to abandon than machinery. The final shift didn't happen in a field. It happened at the Jessup sale barn one Saturday in October. Walt was there selling calves. Business as usual. Nothing dramatic. Phil Kramer walked up beside him. Different suit now. Less shine. They stood shoulder to shoulder watching the auctioneer move cattle through the ring. Phil broke the silence first. I drove past your 40 the other day. Walt nodded. Looks different. Corn did all right. 148. Phil took that in. He had once sold over 100 tractors in that county. He had encouraged expansion because expansion sold equipment. Now many of those customers were gone. I told a lot of guys they needed more horsepower, Phil said quietly. Most of them aren't here anymore. There wasn't bitterness in his voice, just math. After a long pause, he added, "You bought the worst ground in the county, and you're still here." Walt didn't turn to face him. He kept watching the cattle move through the ring. He answered the way his father would have. The ground was never the problem. Phil waited. The debt was. That was the moment the story stopped being about soil entirely. It became about survival, about the difference between growing fast and lasting long. Walt continued farming that 40 for another 27 years. Organic matter eventually climbed above 5%, comparable to virgin prairie soil. The Farmland gave out at 16,000 hours, and he replaced it with a used 560. Bought at auction for cash. He never took out a loan. He never expanded beyond what he could control. He didn't become the largest farmer in Buchanan County. He didn't need to. He stayed. And in a decade when 300,000 farms across America disappeared, staying was not small. It was rare. On Dale Meser's last day before retiring from the Extension Service, he took down the soil map that had hung on his wall for 3 decades. He looked at the white patch in the northwest corner, the 40 acres he once called dead ground. He picked up a black marker and shaded it dark as the best soil in the county. Underneath it, he wrote 2 words, Walt's ground. After that Saturday at the Jessup sale barn, nothing in Buchanan County snapped into a new world overnight. There wasn't a headline. There wasn't a parade. There was just a slow, uncomfortable shift in what people could no longer pretend they hadn't seen. For years, Walt Gunderson had been easy to dismiss because he was quiet and because the land he bought was easy to label. Dead ground, one phrase, and everyone could move on. But once the numbers became repeatable, once 30 acres on that 40 could put up 148 bushels per acre in 1988 while the county averaged 131. And once it became common knowledge that he was doing it without commercial fertilizer and without herbicides, the label stopped protecting anyone's ego. Farmers are practical, but they are also human. And the hardest thing for a human to face is not a bad year. It's the possibility that he suffered for years following advice that wasn't just risky, but unnecessary. That's why the first questions Walt got weren't shouted across the cafe like jokes. They came sideways, quietly, at the edge of a field, with a boot scuffing dirt like the man asking didn't want to be seen asking. How do you keep weeds down? How do you get nitrogen without buying it? How do you plant through that residue? Walt didn't turn into a guru. He didn't stand on a tailgate giving speeches. He answered the way a mechanic answers when someone asks why an engine finally runs right. Simple, specific, and focused on what he actually did. Clover, thyme, manure when he could get it. Grazing when it made sense. No-till when the soil was ready. Move cattle before they beat a spot into dust. Don't tear the ground open just because you feel like you should be doing something. And above all, don't build a business on payments that only work if every year is perfect. The men listening would nod, not because they agreed, but because they recognized the shape of discipline. Walt didn't offer them salvation. He offered them a mirror. And mirrors are hard to look at when you've been told for a decade that the only way to survive is to get bigger, faster, and deeper into debt. The late 1980s didn't stop being painful for the county just because Walt's 40 was improving. The farm crisis had momentum. Land values had already collapsed. The farm credit system was still bleeding losses. Bankers were still nervous. And around Buchanan County, there were families who didn't lose farms because they were lazy or careless, but because they had believed what everyone around them believed when prices were high. That expansion was the safe choice. That's why Walt's story hit a nerve. It wasn't just inspiring. It was threatening. If a man could take the worst soil in the county, pay cash, and turn it into productive ground while using less purchased input and carrying no lender on his back, then it meant the crisis wasn't only an act of God or a twist of markets. It meant decisions mattered. It meant the culture of leverage mattered. In private, some farmers began saying out loud what they couldn't say in public without sounding like they were attacking friends. Maybe we got sold. Maybe we sold ourselves. A few blamed Phil Kramer. because it was easier to blame a salesman than to blame their own signatures. But even that wasn't the full truth. Phil didn't invent the boom. He was a symptom of it. The boom had made everyone believe the same thing at once. That's why it was so dangerous. A shared belief feels like safety until it collapses. Phil's move to selling insurance in Waterloo didn't end his presence in the county. It just changed how he appeared. He'd still drive through sometimes, still stop at the cafe. Not as the loud dealer with the gold watch, but as a man who had watched his customer list evaporate. Over time, his jokes stopped. He became careful with words. He began asking questions too, though never in a way that sounded like apology. In a place like Jessup, men don't apologize with speeches. They apologize by noticing. Phil noticed Walt's 40 without mocking it. He noticed that Walt still drove an old pickup. He noticed that Walt's barn lights were on at the same times every night. Because routine is a kind of faith. He noticed that Walt was still there. Walt noticed Phil too, but he didn't celebrate his fall. He didn't need to. Life had already done the accounting. The deeper change was happening where nobody posted signs in the soil profile. It's hard to explain soil biology to someone who hasn't watched land fail slowly for years. You can say organic matter and aggregate stability and infiltration, and it sounds like academic talk. But farmers don't need poetic words. They need outcomes they can touch. Walt could touch it. He could dig a spade in and feel that the ground was no longer a plate of clay resisting every tool. He could pull up residue and see moisture holding where it used to run off. He could count earthworms not as a fun experiment, but as a signal that the soil was finally doing work again without being forced. The Karen Price thesis out of Iowa State gave that transformation a language outsiders could repeat. It measured the change, organic matter climbing from 1.2% to 3.8% over 7 years, infiltration improving by 340%, worm populations higher than some Class 1 soils. The county didn't need the paper to believe what their eyes could see, but the paper mattered anyway because it did something social. It legitimized Walt's 40 in the one way that could quiet skeptics who still needed permission to admit they were wrong. It wasn't just Walt's opinion anymore. It was data, and data, when it confirms what people have been afraid to say, spreads faster than gossip. Walt never bragged about that thesis. He likely didn't even read it cover to cover, not because he was anti-education, but because his education was already happening every day in the field. He wasn't farming to make a point. He was farming to stay solvent, stay independent, and stay on land his father had left him without a lender attached. That mattered more to him than being right in public. The 1990s arrived, and with them came a slow stabilization in parts of agriculture. But the lesson of the 1980s didn't disappear for Walt. He treated every year like it could turn. That was his advantage. The men who were most wounded by the crisis weren't the ones who had one bad year. They were the ones whose entire plan assumed there would never be a bad year. Walt's plan assumed the opposite. He ran his operation as if hardship was normal, not exceptional. That mindset is not glamorous. It doesn't produce the kind of stories people like to tell at banquets, but it keeps you alive. And because it kept him alive, his 40 kept improving. He continued rotating, continuing to integrate clover and small grains and grazing where it made sense, continuing to avoid purchased inputs when biology could do the job. That doesn't mean he never spent money. He spent money where it created resilience, not where it created appearance. He valued function over shine. The Farmland kept going longer than anyone would have bet. It was already old when Hank ran it. It was ancient by the early 1990s. But Walt was the kind of man who could hear a machine's language. He listened for changes in pitch, vibration, resistance. He didn't wait for a catastrophic failure in the middle of a tight window if he could prevent it. But he also didn't replace something just because a neighbor had newer paint. In 1994, the Farmland finally gave out at around 16,000 hours. If you didn't grow up around tractors, that number might not mean much. In rural Iowa, it means the machine has lived multiple lives. It means it owes you nothing. Walt replaced it the same way he did everything else. No drama, no loan, no dealer. He bought a used Farmel 560 at auction for $800 cash. That detail mattered because it wasn't nostalgia. It was policy. Cash kept him free. Debt would have made him fast, but fast in the wrong direction. The land kept darkening. The slopes held better. The creek along the south edge, which used to run muddy from erosion, ran clearer because soil stayed where it belonged. That's not a moral statement. It's physics. When soil has structure, it doesn't leave. That structure is built by roots, microbes, fungi, time, and not tearing it apart every year. Walt's decisions had created a system that protected itself. As his 40 improved, it didn't just make him money. It reduced his exposure. He didn't have to win a perfect year to survive an imperfect one. Meanwhile, round him, some survivors of the 1980s remained skeptical of anything that sounded like change. They had been burned and didn't want a new ideology. They wanted a simple promise: this will never hurt you. No one could honestly promise that. Walt didn't try. That's another reason his story felt true to listeners. It didn't depend on hope. It depended on method. It depended on restraint. It depended on saying no when saying yes felt exciting. That is exactly the kind of discipline most people admire in hindsight and struggle to practice in real time. In 1998, Dale Measure retired from the Extension Service. By then, he had watched enough years of Walt's 40 to know that calling it dead ground had been a mistake. Not because he hadn't been right about its condition in 1981, but because he had been wrong about its future. Most experts are careful about what they say in public, but privately they know the truth. Forecasts are fragile, and land is not static. On his last day, Dale took down that old soil map that had hung on his office wall for decades. The one that had made farmers feel safe because it divided the world into simple categories. He looked at that pale patch in the northwest corner, the 40 acres he had once dismissed, and he shaded it in dark, the way the best ground was shaded. Then he wrote two words underneath it: Walt's ground. That act was not just about Walt. It was about humility. It was an expert admitting that classification is not destiny. It was a public servant admitting that time and biology can outrun a label. Walt kept farming for years after that, not to prove anyone wrong, but because the work suited him and the outcome mattered to him. In the simplest way, it allowed him to keep living the way his father had lived, owing no man. He didn't become wealthy in the way people imagine wealth. He didn't stack new tractors in sheds. He didn't buy land for the sake of owning more land. He farmed what he could manage. He built what he could maintain. He avoided the kind of expansion that turns a business into a hostage of the next interest rate. And year after year, his 40 kept improving. By the time he retired in 2015, the organic matter on that ground had climbed above 5% comparable to virgin prairie soil and outcome. That would have sounded like fantasy in 1981 when the map called it Class 6 and a dealer laughed about coffins. Walt never celebrated that with speeches. He didn't need to. The proof was underfoot. The land that had once been a blank, pale insult on a county map had become something else entirely, not just productive, but resilient. The kind of ground that holds together in heat and holds on through rain. And if you ask what the real victory was, it wasn't the 657% increase in appraised value from $185 an acre to roughly $1 per hundred within those first 7 years. And it wasn't even the yields that embarrassed better ground. The real victory was that Walt got to stay through a crisis that pushed hundreds of thousands out. He kept his independence. He kept his routine. He kept the right to wake up on land that was his because he paid for it, not because a bank allowed it. In the end, the story isn't a man-made dead ground bloom. That's just the surface people like because it feels dramatic. The story underneath is simpler and sharper. When a whole culture confused leverage with strength, one man confused neither, and that difference quiet, boring, repeatable beat everything loud around him. By the time the early 2000s rolled in, most people in Buchanan County no longer introduced Walt Gunderson as the guy who bought dead ground. They introduced him as the one who made it work. That shift sounds small, but in a rural county reputation compounds slowly. Walt hadn't changed his personality, hadn't become more talkative, hadn't started advising anyone on how they should farm. What changed was the context around him. The generation that came up during the 1970s expansion had been shaped by optimism and leverage. The generation coming up after the 1980s had been shaped by caution. Younger farmers had seen auctions they couldn't forget. They had watched fathers sign papers they wished they hadn't. They were more open to listening. And when they looked at Walt's 40, they didn't see a miracle. They saw a system that didn't collapse under stress. That distinction mattered. Walt's operation was never flashy. He didn't chase new hybrids just because they promised a few extra bushels on perfect ground. He didn't overhaul equipment unless it was necessary. He didn't adopt every new program that offered short-term payments at the cost of long-term control. He evaluated everything the same way. Does this reduce risk or does it add it? That question shaped decisions most people never saw. For example, when input suppliers pushed bundled packages seed, fertilizer, chemical contracts tied together with financing options, Walt ran the math without emotion. If the package required a note that depended on hitting a high-yield target to break even, he passed, not because he distrusted technology, but because he distrusted dependency. Dependency, in his experience, was the quiet door through which banks eventually walked. As regenerative agriculture slowly entered mainstream discussion in the late 1990s and early 2000s, academics and policy people began using language that described what Walt had already been doing for nearly 2 decades. Words like soil health, carbon sequestration, biological systems, and resilience started appearing in conferences and journals. For Walt, those weren't buzzwords. They were observations. He had seen soil darken. He had seen infiltration improve. He had watched erosion decrease. When heavy rains came, he didn't watch topsoil float toward the creek like he had in the early years. When dry spells hit, he didn't see his fields shut down first. Those changes weren't theoretical. They were operational. But what made his story continue to resonate wasn't just agronomy. It was contrast. In the years after the crisis, as markets stabilized and new technologies arrived, many farmers slowly rebuilt with a different mindset. But some old habits returned too. Expansion returned in cycles. Land values rose again. Interest rates eventually softened. Optimism crept back in. Walt noticed the shift without commenting on it. He had lived long enough to know that every boom feels permanent until it isn't. That memory shaped his restraint. There were years when he could have leveraged his appreciated 40 acres to buy additional land at decent prices. Banks would have lent to him easily. His track record was strong. His balance sheet was clean. But leverage was not neutral in his mind. It was a tool with teeth. He chose not to pick it up again. That choice confused some people. Why not grow? Why not take advantage of opportunity? The answer wasn't philosophical. It was practical. He didn't want growth that required perfect conditions to survive. He wanted continuity. That mindset influenced how he managed risk across seasons. When commodity prices spiked briefly in the mid-2000s, some operators ramped up inputs to chase higher yields. Walt kept his system steady. He understood something simple: volatility punishes those who build around peaks. His soil system buffered him. Higher organic matter meant better water retention. Stable aggregates meant fewer surprises after storms. A functioning biological network meant nutrients were cycled more efficiently. That translated to predictable output. Predictable output, paired with low input costs, meant margin that didn't evaporate when markets swung. Margin, more than yield, was his compass. As more producers began experimenting with cover crops and reduced tillage, a few visited Walt not as skeptics, but as students. He never framed himself as ahead of his time. He simply described what he had done when no one was watching. The key difference between his story and late adopters was not intelligence. It was timing under pressure. Walt had been forced into innovation by constraint. He didn't have the capital to farm dead ground conventionally. So he changed the question. Instead of asking how to make bad land act like good land with more inputs, he asked how to make soil act like soil again. That reframing was subtle but powerful. Many farmers who came later approached regenerative practices as an addition to conventional systems. Walt approached them as the foundation. That difference in sequencing shaped everything. In interviews years later, some extension agents would reference his 40 as an early practical example of biological restoration without heavy subsidy. That wasn't how Walt described it. To him, it was common sense extended over time. But time is the part most people skip. That's why his story continued to hold attention when retold. It forced listeners to confront patience as a competitive advantage. The cultural shift in Buchanan County was gradual. By the late 2000s, it wasn't unusual to hear someone say, "Remember when they called that dead ground?" Not as a joke, but as a reminder. That memory became shorthand for a broader lesson. Labels can trap thinking. Younger farmers began running their own small experiments, cover crops on marginal acres, reduced tillage on slopes, manure partnerships instead of synthetic heavy programs. Not all of them succeeded immediately. Some struggled, but they had an example within driving distance that showed the path wasn't fantasy. Walt's 40 didn't guarantee their outcomes. It proved the concept possible, and possibility matters when risk is high. As Walt approached retirement age, nothing about his routine suggested a man seeking recognition. He still kept records by hand. He still evaluated soil by feel as much as by lab report. He still preferred talking about rainfall patterns and cattle health over discussing market forecasts. When asked directly about his success, he deflected credit toward process. "You don't fix soil in a year," he'd say. "You stop hurting it first." That sentence captured more than agronomy. It captured discipline. Most systems fail not because they lack inputs, but because they absorb damage faster than they repair. Walt's approach reversed that equation. Over decades, the cumulative effect of small, consistent decisions became visible in ways numbers alone couldn't fully capture. The creek along the south boundary of his 40 ran clearer during heavy rain events than it had in the early 1980s. Slopes that once shed topsoil held firm. The darker soil wasn't cosmetic. It represented stored carbon, improved structure, and moisture buffering that reduced the amplitude of extreme weather impacts. Climate variability became a growing topic nationally. But Walt had already built adaptability into his ground long before the language shifted. His system wasn't designed for headlines. It was designed for variance. By the time he retired in 2015, the 40 acres that once sat nearly erased from county crop records had organic matter levels exceeding 5%, comparable to virgin prairie soil. That outcome didn't require spectacle. It required decades. He didn't exit farming under foreclosure pressure. He didn't liquidate under stress. He stepped away on his own terms. That fact alone separated him from many stories of that era. When he finally reduced operations, it wasn't because debt forced him out. It was because time had run its natural course. In communities that watched neighbors lose everything in the 1980s, voluntary retirement carries a quiet dignity. The larger narrative of American agriculture will always include cycles of boom and bust, innovation and consolidation, leverage and reform. Walt Gunderson's 40 acres did not change national policy. It did not reverse global markets. But within one county in Iowa, it became a counterexample to inevitability. It demonstrated that under pressure, an alternative path existed, one built on restraint, biology, cash discipline, and patience. That combination didn't produce headlines in 1981 when a dealer laughed about coffins. It produced resilience. And resilience, though rarely celebrated in real time, is what remains when trends fade. The map in Dale Meser's office changed before Walt retired, but the deeper change occurred in how people interpreted ground itself. Soil was no longer only a category defined by a survey. It was a system capable of recovery. And recovery, as Walt's 40 proved, is less about luck than about decisions repeated long enough to compound. In the end, the story's power never rested solely in bushels or appraised value. It rested in continuity. In a decade when 300,000 American farms disappeared, Walt's did not. In a culture that equated growth with safety, he demonstrated that control could be safer than scale. And in a county that once shaded his land nearly white, the darkest soil came from the place everyone had written off first. Retirement did not arrive for Walt Gunderson with a ceremony or a speech. It arrived the way most things had arrived in his life, quietly, without announcement, as the natural result of years doing the same thing well enough that there was nothing left to prove. By 2015, the 40 acres that once carried the nickname Dead Ground no longer needed defending. No one called it that anymore. Younger farmers in Buchanan County knew the story only because their fathers had told it, as a cautionary tale or, depending on the father, as a confession. The land survey still listed classifications. The county records still described slope and soil type. But anyone who had stepped onto Walt's ground after a hard rain or during a dry August knew the difference between what a map says and what a field does. Organic matter had climbed above 5%, levels comparable to virgin prairie soil that had never been stripped and pushed. That wasn't an overnight miracle. It was the accumulation of seasons where restraint beat impulse. Walt never framed it as triumph. He framed it as maintenance. If you stop tearing it up, it fixes itself, he'd say. That sentence applied to more than soil. When he finally reduced operations and stepped back, it wasn't under pressure from a banker or because a balance sheet forced him to sell. He stepped back because the work had been done long enough. That detail mattered more than people admitted. In the 1980s, too many exits had come with auctions, with lines of equipment tagged and cataloged, with neighbors walking through barns they once admired. Walt's exit did not come with an auctioneer's chant. It came with continuity. The land remained stable. The system held. And the story that people told about him began to shift from the man who bought the worst 40 to the man who never owed. That shift was the real summary. Because in the end, his 40 acres were never just about agronomy. They were about independence under pressure. Looking back across the decades, the turning points weren't dramatic explosions. They were small refusals. Refusing to borrow when borrowing was fashionable. Refusing to plow when plowing was automatic. Refusing to chase yield at the cost of margin. Refusing to scale beyond control. Those refusals looked conservative in the moment. They looked cautious. They looked old-fashioned. But over time, they revealed something sharper. Discipline compounds. The farm crisis of the 1980s remains one of the most painful chapters in American agriculture. More than 300,000 farms disappeared. Entire communities thinned. Churches closed. Sale barns filled with equipment that had once represented optimism. In that context, Walt's 40 acres stand not as a fairy tale, but as a counterexample. The land that everyone dismissed did not change overnight. It changed because someone stopped demanding immediate output from exhausted soil and started rebuilding its foundation. That pattern mirrors the financial side of his life. He stopped demanding growth from borrowed capital and started building margin from what he already owned. The parallel is too clean to ignore. Soil and balance sheets respond to the same pressure. Overwork them with leverage, and they collapse. Feed them patiently, and they stabilize. When people repeat the line he told Phil Kramer, the ground was never the problem. The debt was. It can sound like a slogan, but it wasn't meant as one. It was a summary delivered in a sale barn after years of watching neighbors lose what they thought was secure. Phil himself became part of the lesson. He was not a villain. He was a participant in a culture that equated expansion with survival. When that culture cracked, he adjusted. He sold insurance instead of tractors. He became quieter. His conversation with Walt in 1988 did not rewrite the past, but it acknowledged it. In rural counties, that kind of acknowledgement travels farther than anger. It allowed the story to settle without bitterness. Walt never mocked the men who had once mocked him. He understood how easy it is to follow momentum. He simply stepped outside of it. The most striking part of the 40-acre transformation is how ordinary it looked up close. There were no secret chemicals, no sudden windfalls, no hidden inheritance. Just clover seeded by hand in 1981 when everyone expected corn. Just manure hauled in borrowed equipment. Just cattle rotated carefully across slopes. Just a modified planter cutting through residue instead of ripping soil apart. Just soil samples taken year after year to measure progress instead of assume it. Just a refusal to trade independence for speed. When Karen Price's thesis circulated through academic circles, it gave the 40 acres a language that professionals could cite. Biological restoration, increased infiltration, improved aggregate stability. But the farmers in Buchanan County did not need technical phrasing to understand what had happened. They needed to see that a field once nearly erased from crop records could outperform higher-rated land because someone respected process more than prediction. They needed to see that staying solvent through a downturn required less bravado and more math. They needed to see that a man with an old tractor and no loans could outlast men with new machines and large notes. And most of all, they needed to see that what everyone calls dead can recover if it is given time and not stripped again. As years passed, the phrase dead ground lost its edge. It became a memory, something older farmers would mention when pointing out the darkest patch of soil near the river bluffs that used to be white on the map. They'd say. Younger farmers might ask why, and the answer would come not as a lecture, but as a story about the early 1980s, about high interest rates and falling land values, about a man who walked past a bidding war for 280 acres of prime soil and raised his hand only when the worst piece came up, about paying $185 an acre in cash while others paid $3,000 to $100 on notes, about seeding clover when others planted corn, about counting earthworms instead of horsepower. The story would end the same way every time, with a quiet line in a sale barn, with a former dealer admitting that most of the men he sold to were gone, with Walt's response that the ground wasn't the issue, the debt was. That ending works because it isn't dramatic. It doesn't rely on revenge. It relies on recognition. By the time Dale Measure retired and shaded the pale patch on the soil map dark, writing Walt's ground beneath it, the transformation was complete in more ways than one. The map had changed, but so had the mindset of the county. Not entirely. Agriculture never becomes immune to cycles. But enough had shifted that caution regained respect. Enough had shifted that soil biology was no longer a fringe concept. Enough had shifted that expansion was no longer automatically equated with wisdom. Walt's 40 acres did not eliminate risk from farming. Nothing can. But they demonstrated that risk managed through restraint often beats risk amplified by leverage. When he retired in 2015, there was no headline. There didn't need to be. The evidence was already underfoot. The organic matter above 5%, the stable yields, the low input costs, the absence of foreclosure notices in his mailbox across decades when many received them. He did not get rich in the way some measure wealth. He got something rarer in that era. He got to stay. And in a decade that erased hundreds of thousands of farms, staying was a victory large enough. If someone drives past the northwest corner near the river bluffs today, they won't see a sign announcing the history. They'll see dark soil, consistent crops, and slopes that hold together after storms. They won't know that the same 40 acres once carried the lightest shade on a county map. They won't hear the laughter from the feed store in 1981. They won't feel the tension of 1985 when uneven corn stands gave skeptics hope that biology would fail. They won't stand in the sale barn in 1988 when a former tractor dealer admitted something had gone wrong with the way everyone thought about growth. But the outcome remains. The darkest ground in the county came from the place everyone once dismissed, not because it was secretly better, because someone stopped asking it to be something it wasn't and started rebuilding what it needed to function. That is the full arc of the 40 acres. A piece of land labeled dead, a man labeled stubborn, a county caught in a boom that turned to collapse, and over years, not weeks, a reversal built on discipline instead of speed. When the story is told well, it doesn't sound like a myth. It sounds like a warning and an invitation at the same time. A warning about what leverage can do when it replaces judgment, and an invitation to build systems, whether in soil or finance, that can survive more than one perfect year. Walt Gunderson never set out to become an example. He set out to avoid owing any man anything. In doing that, he ended up proving something larger than he intended, that resilience is quieter than ambition, slower than expansion, and far more durable than both.